the history of Korean rock from 1963 to 1980. This episode, Korean psychedelic rock from 1970 to 1975. Hello and welcome back to the second episode in this mini podcast series where we take a deep dive into the history of Korean rock from the 1960s all the way to the end of the 1970s. As always, I'm your host Sean, and I'm joined by my dear co-host Pharaoh Mount, who will be the one getting introduced to the music. Hello. If this is the type of content you're interested in, please do check out our first episode in the series where we cover Korean rock in the 1960s. Just to note, we will be skipping over a fair bit of albums today since there's just too much that was released during this time, and we can't possibly cover them all. Look at how long this episode is. So apologies if I don't mention an album or a track you really enjoy. We cut out some of the stuff that I felt weren't as significant, or I didn't have much to talk about. Where we last left off, rock music in South Korea was transitioning from the 60s invasion type beat groups to more serious psychedelic rock. In case you missed our last episode, we mentioned how Korean musicians and bands from this time mostly all had a history of performing at US Army bases, and thus were very skilled, much more than your average garage rock band that you'd see sometimes in the West. There's a lot of music to cover in this episode, so let's start off strong with where we last left off. In 1970, the five-piece supergroup He5 releases a couple more albums, one of which being a record titled Hey Jude. This album is entirely made up of covers of Western hits, but it still shows the group's performance and arrangement skills are very good. Take, for example, this cover of You Keep Me Hanging On. Here's a clip. We hear more of the same fuzz guitar sound that we heard on previous records, but this time with really nice vocals that have a lot of soul in them, which is one of the reasons why I enjoy this track very much.
That's the album of Somewhere, isn't it? And is it Somewhere or Maria? I don't remember. Good album. I mean, it's okay. It's an okay album.
I particularly like the vocals in that one, in this song. Very soulful, very strong vocals. You don't hear that a lot over here. It's more just harmonies, not like this. However, this musical highlight of their career wouldn't last too long, as one by one, most of the band members started leaving the group. Some to go to the US and some to join other groups. The fate of He5 was left uncertain, as only the lead guitarist and the bassist remained. Why don't we put a pin in that story and come back to it in just a bit. For now, let's talk about the Key Boys. Where we last left off, members of the so-called Korean Beatles had all left the group by the late 1960s and were replaced by others one by one. One of the first albums to have none of the original members is simply titled Second Album, perhaps to distance themselves from the old Key Boys name, which, to be frank, had nothing to do with this album. This album would launch the Key Boys into the mainstream with their song Let's Go to the Beach, which became a mega hit. Unfortunately, it was later found out that that song was completely lifted from a Japanese song. Personally, I see it more of as a cover than plagiarism. Cover that couldn't be properly credited because Japanese songs would often be banned in Korea at the time. So I saw it more as a way of getting around that, although it's not, legally okay. Instead, let's listen to a more impressive track, Boat Song. Okay, without me telling you any of the context, what did you think of it initially?
It sounded very like jazzy at the beginning, like in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as it goes on, I don't know, it feels like a bit, what's the word? I don't know, but I think the psychedelic thing actually does work. It's very much in tune with like actually soundtrack sounds from back then, but
Mm-hmm.
like actually soundtrack sounds from like a few years ago. Not a few years ago to me, but for them,
Yeah.
like I think like Exodus
So you're talking like in the 60s.
in the 60s. Yeah.
Boat Song was originally a traditional Korean song, and it seems like it was a favorite amongst Korean bands to cover. It shows that as early as the 1970s, Korean bands and artists inherently found the need to incorporate their Koreanness into the rock music they were playing, a tradition that still continues to this day. Now, let's talk about the godfather of Korean rock, Shin Jung-hyun. In the 1970s, he picked up a lot of artists that would sing his songs, but he also lost a few. Artists come and go, especially if they become extremely famous, and that's what happened to the Pearl Sisters. After launching them into fame with their 1968 album, they soon signed a deal with Jigu Records and would not only move record labels, but also worked with different songwriters, essentially losing their psychedelic touch that made them so special. After losing the Pearl Sisters, the owner of King Records, Universal Records, and many other record labels, King Park, who was it was quite a crazy character in his own right, decided to make one last Pearl Sisters album without anyone's permission. This trend would actually continue with King Park. He was insane.
Are we going to make an episode on him eventually?
Maybe, but I need to look more into it because it seems that every time I look into it, I find something new that's just insane about him. This is the only, quote, new song on the record, Trumpet Pants.
봄바람이 살랑살랑 내 마음도 살랑살랑 나팔바지 스며들면 봄바람이 스며들.
So Trumpet Pants obviously refers to those sort of jeans that get get wider towards the end of the leg, and those were very much in fashion in the 70s. Nice little song. Definitely should have been a 7-inch single because all the songs on the album, the rest of the songs were all previously released. But obviously 7-inch singles weren't a thing in Korea at the time, or at least they weren't common amongst the consumer crowd. 1970 also saw a pair of artists release their debut albums through Shin Jung-hyun. First, there was Chang Hyun, a deep-voiced singer who would also later become famous through other Shin songs. Here's a snippet of the title track, Please Wait.
그날이 오면 그날이 오면 그날이 오면 만나리라 그대 손 내 손에 안으며 하고픈 그 말을 다하리 그대 검은 눈 바라보며 행복하게 살아야지 기다려주며
Hyun. I don't know. He has a Sinatra thing going on. He's more of a crooner type.
Yeah.
He's sitting like trad pop, like a western trad pop kind of thing.
Do note that this song is very much different from the hits he would be actually known for in the future, but it's still a good track and it shows off his vocal range, and I quite like that part towards the, I think it's like the chorus section where his voice gets higher. I quite like that.
Is it like a key change, or does
It's not a key change. But it does show off his like, it feels like stronger vocal parts than the verses, which obviously should be a thing. Released on the same day was another debut album, this time by a female singer called Ima Young. Here's a snippet of the leading track off this record, Oh I Can't Trust.
나만 보면 붙잡고 못 산다고 하지만 못 믿어 날만 새면 날 찾아 온 동네를 헤매지만 못 믿어 꿈 같은 이야기만 쉴 새 없이 하지만 그 말은 거짓말 이제 다시는 못 믿어 그 사람은 못 믿어
You know, she's one of my favorite female vocalists from Korea during this time because I just love how her voice sounds.
She does sound good, yes.
And this record does show off her vocals. I don't know how to describe it. It sounds quite unique, different from the other sort of singers at the time. The way it goes into the high notes.
She does the more Jenny Z and how can I even say this? Like early Linda Ronstadt when she was in her folk group. I forgot what her folk group was called.
In the following year, she would contribute more songs to a split album, this time not written by Shin, before disappearing completely from the public eye. This was quite common since she got married and a lot of Korean singers, especially female singers at the time, would retire after their marriage. Ima Young was someone who could have had a great singing career, but unfortunately it was cut short, and now her name is obscure to anyone who isn't like a serious Korean record collector. Most of her songs were later given to Chang Hyun, who later made them hits, and most people think a lot of those songs are Chang Hyun's songs, but originally they were given to Ima Young. Now, Shin Jung-hyun also kept himself busy by constantly performing live with these musicians, and one of these performances was thankfully recorded, albeit illegally. King Park, again, we mentioned King Park, this is the second time we mentioned him in this episode, owner of Universal Records and many others we previously talked about, recorded this entire live performance without the knowledge of any of the performance, including Shin himself. Since this was a bootleg recording technically, the audio quality does suffer, but it does provide us with a piece of historic performance that we wouldn't have otherwise. Shin plays Inagada Davida in its entirety during this performance, but since that track was performed by many other bands at this time, instead I'll play the less common cover, Funky Broadway. Here's a clip. Great performance by Shin anyways. Again, it would have been lost forever to time if King Park didn't illegally record it. Being released without the approval of performance, many including Shin, didn't know this was even getting recorded or released until the records hit the shops. So, was he truly right to do this? Not if the performance approved of this record, but we wouldn't have this historic recording otherwise.
I mean, is it right? No, but I think it's a good historical record.
Exactly. The band that performed on that live show was Shin's new band called The Questions, and the singer was Park In-soo. Questions only released one studio album with vocals. There is also an instrumental album, which most likely would have been performed by The Questions. But unlike the Ad 4 album, they bring outside singers to sing on the track rather than the band members singing themselves. Many of these singers, including the previously mentioned Park In-soo, were no strangers to this type of music, as they would have been performing with Shin for quite a while at this point. One of my favorite tracks on this album was sung by Park In-soo and is called Hello. Here is a snippet.
여보세요 아내만 들어봐요 여보세요 걸음을 멈춰봐요 안타까운 내 심정 그대 잡고 물어라 여보세요 내 말 들어봐요 만나는 사람들 내 심정
It's a very catchy psychedelic pop song, I think.
I agree.
Park In-soo has a very distinctive, over-expressive accent. That's the only way I could think of describing his accent. That makes him stand out, and I really like that about his voice. It's very distinctive. I say this a lot, but it is very distinctive from your normal singer from this time. And Shin Jin-hyun was really good at picking out those kinds of singers and putting him in his inner circle of artists.
Is it like a sort of regional accent or just the tone of his voice?
I think it's just what his singing voice is like. It's very expressive. It's kind of this is weird. It's a weird comparison, but it's like a New Yorker accent almost, but for Korea.
That's interesting.
Yeah, we keep flip flopping back and forth, but that's what just this podcast is apparently. Let's turn our attention back to the Key Boys again. The Korean Beatles turned psychedelic after all their member change. Remember? Well, in the same year of 1970 as their second album, the Key Boys also released their third and final studio album. The first album by the second generation of Key Boys, it was beloved by critics and collectors for its strong psychedelic sound, and the second album is beloved by the general public for the sheer amount of hits on that same record. So it's fair to say that the third release went quite under the radar, doesn't have any strong numbers or hits, and the musical style is radically different to their previous efforts. You understand what I mean after I play a snippet of the song Time for You to Leave.
떠나갈 시간 안녕 안녕
It's very trot-like, basically.
What scale are they playing?
It's one of the I think it's like it's either a harmonic minor or a melodic minor. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Fair enough.
But it's very it's used a lot in trot music. We explained in the last episode, but basically trot is this old type of music inspired by Japanese enka, and it's pretty much the equivalent to standards or old pop in the West, except it's very much still popular. I've heard some people say that this record is a mix of rock and trot, or psychedelic and trot, but I can't really see the rock or psychedelic element in this apart from the fact that they used rock instruments. Not saying it's a bad album. It sounds quite good to my ears, actually. But I wouldn't recommend this to people seeking out the earlier psychedelic sound of their first two albums.
I mean, to be fair, what's the traditional trot instrumentation?
It does use like a acoustic guitar from time to time, and most of it nowadays too. It uses a lot of orchestra instruments, like a lot of string instruments.
Then I guess by having a rock, what's the word? It's not falsetto, but by having a rock band playing it, I guess it does make it rock. Like at least if you're from
yeah,
works there,
but not in sort of a sense of the genre mixes rock and roll. I don't think this does it quite for me.
Fair enough.
The Keyboys trail ends cold after this album. They released a greatest hits record in 1975 with new mixes and even an unreleased track. That album gets reissued in the 80s and 90s, cementing the second generation Keyboys as the definitive version of the band to many around the country. There are photo evidences of the band performing after 1970, but all we have record-wise are a bunch of reissues of the same old albums, and the studio albums end with the third release that you just heard. We've talked about the Keyboys, we've talked about He5, and we've talked about Shinjin and Span, the Questions. All very big names in the Korean rock scene during this time, and all massively sought after by record collectors. But a band that often gets forgotten about simply due to the fact that they never released a full-length album are the Bees, who are often called the Korean Steppenwolf. Here's one of my favorite covers of theirs, Steppenwolf's Suki Suki. Very garage rock sounding, you know, with the rough sort of less, it's like lower audio quality.
What are they called, the Korean Steppenwolf guy?
A lot of Korean music historians and record collectors.
Fair.
Very, you know, garage like, nice fuzz tones we talked about last time. Impressive that they could pull off that harder rock sound on this record at a time when the labels wanted bands to sing more softer, commercial, mellow songs. I actually heard this version of Suki Suki prior to me hearing the original by Steppenwolf, and I was actually quite disappointed at the Steppenwolf version because it sounded almost too clean compared to this cover.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good thing about, like, I mean, it depends on your taste, of course, but that's a very interesting thing about the bands at that time. The cheaper equipment that they were forced to use does have a fuzzier tone.
Yeah, it has a similar sound to like the Sonics, and I also like the Sonics for that reason. Very lo-fi recordings. Again, these songs were only released as a part of various artists' release, but there are some great numbers on here nonetheless, such as the shorter 4-minute cover of Inagada da Vida, and even Born to be Wild. So they covered 2 Steppenwolf songs on this single record. The band was on another various artist release, contributing 3 songs the following year, so they have 7 songs in total that we have recorded. I would have loved to see what a full album by this group would have sounded like, because this is the only one of the few times I've seen a Korean band break out of the Korean pop and trot mold and actually record what they're comfortable with playing with. Finally, here's the last album I've prepared for the year 1970. Yes, this whole time we've just been talking about the year 1970 and the releases from that point. Remember where we left off with He5? Apart from the lead guitarist and the bassist, all the members had left. That was during 1970, so it's quite a shock that the band regrouped and released a new record later that same year. This time, the new lineup consisted of a rhythm guitarist, a keyboardist, a drummer, a flute player, along with the bassist and the lead guitarist. So now we have 6 members instead of 5. The group renamed themselves to He6, obviously, and released their first record at the tail end of 1970. The album is essentially made up of 2 halves. One side is of Korean songs and some oldies, even traditional numbers, but this time actually arranged like a psychedelic rock song with a ton of fuzz. And the other side is made up of covers of Western songs like Proud Mary and Evil Ways by Santana. The track I'll play from this album is from the Korean side. It's a cover of a very old song called Hwangseongyeta, or in the literal English translation, Ancient Site of a Ruined Castle. Here is a snippet. has that great fuzz sound paired with the nice harmonized vocals. It's the fuzz sound completely transforms the song, but with the harmonized vocals, it still uh, makes the song recognizable as the song they're covering.
I like it.
He6 were actually quite famous for their harmonies, and as all of the members could sing, all six. There was actually a story where during one of their live shows, the band would all get up on stage and sing the Beatles song because a cappella style, harmonizing with each other with only an acoustic guitar backing them.
That's actually really fun. Do we have a recording of that?
Yeah, no, it kills me that we don't have any audio recordings of their songs live, because from these stories, they sound like they were actually quite revolutionary even on stage. They apparently even had a performance where during the solo of Santana's Evil Ways, all the members would get on stage, get on percussion instruments and just play a solo on a percussion instrument.
Oh, that's fun.
The keyboardist himself alone was also very talented, as he would fill in for missing members during live shows, and he'd play drums or guitar when those members couldn't be at the shows, because he was a multi-instrumentalist. What's interesting that the keyboardist mainly chose to sing vocals only and maybe a little bit of keyboard when he had the talent to basically play any instrument he wanted. He chose not to. Shortly after, the very next year, in 1971, He6 released their second album, creatively titled Volume 2. This album is more geared towards covering Western songs, to great effect, I might add. Here's a snippet of their cover of Dance to the Music. I just love the energy in that song. It's so fun.
Yeah, it's very wild.
Yeah. You could really hear their impressive musicianship on that song, and their skills only improved as they went on. He6 kept themselves really busy during the year of 1971, but we'll hear more about them later on. Starting from the 1960s, there were three big songwriters slash guitarists in the US Army bases. Shin Jung-hyun, Lee In-sung, where we talked about last time, where he backed a 6-year-old singer on a record, and someone who we have yet to mention, Kim Hee-gap. Kim Hee-gap was very instrumental in the history of early Korean rock bands, helping out bands like Keyboys and He5 write their songs. From time to time, his band also released a couple of instrumental albums, with a record called Go Go Is Fun being one of my favorites. We've heard the Keyboys' interpretation of the boat song, mixing the traditional Korean sounds with psychedelia, but here you can hear Kim Hee-gap arrange the song in a Latin style. Here's a clip.
What Latin style is this? That's pretty good.
Yeah, it's like, I love that bongo sound especially. It's like intense bongo performance.
Who the bongo player is in this track?
I think it's a jazz percussionist called Yu Bok Sung.
Yeah. Actually, that does raise a good how many like Korean rock musicians at that time were classically trained?
Quite a few actually, because Shin Jin-yeon's first album, with the first thing we covered in the last episode, that was very very almost jazzy almost. Back then, all the musicians had to read from sheet music. All the guitarists, the drummers, the bassist.
I especially asked because so like I presume that before that like what was the pop music before that really? I mean, was it just tracks? The
It's
same
kind
style
of
of like trotting?
trot based, yeah. Old Korean pop music is slightly different, slightly different sounding, but uh, I class people better with better knowledge than me at trot music would probably class them differently, but uh, it's derivative of trot a lot of the time, a lot of the popular music at the time. With a similar sound and with the same band, Kim Hee-gap also released Go-Go Sound Volume 1. I should also mention that go-go was a very popular genre with Korean bands during this time. The name go-go comes from the Whiskey A Go-Go Club, and essentially it's the kind of Korean version of progressive rock with influences from bands like Santana, Rare Earth, and even Creedence to some degree.
Hard rock, wouldn't it be? Maybe progressive rock.
Yeah, a
I
lot
don't
of
know.
progressive rock. A lot of the longer songs were called go-go songs.
Sounds more like jam. It's
Yeah, it has some elements of jam rock in there too. Yeah. On this particular album, you can hear Kim Hee-gap and his band perform uniquely arranged versions of Shin Jin-yeon's songs. We played the Pearl Sisters song "You" in the last episode, which essentially was the first Shin Jin-yeon song to become a hit. Now I'll play the Kim Hee-gap version of the same track. If you remember, whereas the original composition was rather simple with just an acoustic guitar and strings, with the full band only coming in towards the end of the song, this is a whole different rocked up version, with again great bongos in the background. I need to mention I love that bongo sound.
I love rock with bongos. I don't know. There was an era like in the 60s where there was a lot of how can I say it? I guess the early 70s as well, where there was a lot of not traditionally rock instrumentation, like world quote unquote instrumentation
Hmm.
in rock music, and I'm a sucker for that stuff. I'm a
Yeah,
sucker for like bongo
you
tablets and
you're
stuff.
so caught up in most rock songs being guitar, bass, drums, and maybe sometimes keyboards that when you hear something new, it sort of reinvigorates your brain. It's
Especially percussion instruments, really.
Yeah, percussion instruments. You forget how many there are, because you're usually used to like the drum kit having most of the stuff you need. But so remember the story of the Keyboys, the original members that made up the initial Korean Beatles before they all left at the end of the 60s and either went solo or joined other bands. One of the original members, the drummer Yoon Han-gi, formed a new group, originally also called the Keyboys. They released their first album in 1971 with the artist name being Keyboys. And this is where it gets real confusing. Since the second generation of the Keyboys were still active, I assume there was a lot of argument and debate over who got to use the Keyboys name. On one hand, Yoon Han-gi was the original member of the Keyboys, and none of the original members in none of the members in the second generation of Keyboys were original members. None of them came up with that name initially. The Keyboys name brought with it quite a bit of fame and audience with it, so it was important to keep the name. Eventually, the Keyboys, led by Yunangi, decided to change their name to Key Brothers. The subsequent pressings of this album depict that change. Key Brothers cover a few Shinjingan songs on this album, but the standout track has to be a song entitled Let's Dance the Go-Go, a 10-minute long track made up of covers of Santana songs and even a traditional Korean song called Bom Taryang. It's hard to show off this track in a short snippet, so I highly recommend you seek out the full track on your own free time, but here's just a snippet of my favorite section. That's just a 1-minute snippet. The whole song is full of wonderful performances, and the main sections in that song where they cover Evil Ways, so good.
People at the time really loved Evil Ways.
Yeah, they loved covering Santana songs in Korea. They loved covering Creedence songs. There's like some songs that they loved covering. We'll get to this later, but a lot of bands loved to cover Get Ready by Rare Earth and Inagada da Vida by Iron Butterfly, as you saw. There's actually a bootleg album pressed in Korea where the A-side was the entirety of Rare Earth's Get Ready, and the B-side is the entirety of Iron Butterfly's Inagada da Vida. So there was essentially just 2 tracks on that album. Going a bit obscure now, most Korean collectors know He6, Keyboys, and even Key Brothers, but a band that's often missing from those discussions is The Q. With quite an unusual name, the band originates from another group called the Midopas, and like many other acts at the time, they were quite active at the US Army bases and go-go clubs. Unfortunately, they only ever released one album with no further reissues after its initial release. And so the album is quite hard to listen to, let alone collect. They do a lot of covers on this record, but one of my favorites is an original called At the Beach. And here's a snippet.
소리 없이 밀려온다 파도와 함께 영혼을 남기면서 해변가에서 반짝이는 모래사장에 남겨진 두 발자국
Great track. I would almost classify it under psychedelic pop, but genre setting is dangerous. It's honestly a shame that this group, and many others like them, only ever got one release. Because with bands like the Keyboys and He6, we saw, or we will see, how great they've gotten over time. Another band with only one release goes by the name of Idol. I've already shown Farah a few tracks off this album, but essentially this band is quite significant due to their name being the first known use case of the phrase idol to refer to a musical act. But in fact, the music of the idols couldn't be more different to the modern day K-pop idols. Have a listen to their cover of Purple Haze.
It's a very faithful cover to the original.
It is. I heard one Japanese collector call that the most like gloomy, dark version of Purple Haze that they've ever heard. Yeah, but it's just a longer clip over there, just to show you all the vocal parts. But yeah, the slower and quite a bit more messier than other tracks from this time, but that's the spirit of garage rock. This band is by far the most amateurish sounding. I don't know. I don't even know how they even got this album approved by the label, but it does certainly make them unique in the sea of psychedelic pop rock groups from Korea during this time with all their relatively polished sound compared to this album. Yet another group that made a debut record in 1971 were the Devils. The Devils were active since the late 1960s and saw themselves more as a soul group than a rock band. They were quite obscure in the eyes of the public, but the success of the Go-Go 70s movie, which was loosely based on the story of the band, launched them into notoriety in recent times. Although they are more known for their second album today, here's a snippet of the song Sending My Heart to the One Who's Leaving off their first record.
가는 일 보내는 일 마음은 괴로워 사랑에 남기는 서러운 이별 주어진 사랑도 끊임의 언약도 흐르는 눈물로 어무한 물거품 가슴 깊은
Nice prominent bass track there, but in my ears, it sounds quite underwhelming.
It's not rock. It is just I guess it is so.
Yeah, it is.
They're
So.
trying to do clearly like thanks to the liver thing.
Mm.
I butchered that, but like signed, sealed, and delivered thing.
Mm.
And I think they do it quite well. But I don't know, it's a bit too fifth dimension-y.
We've mentioned this before, but most bands who released albums during this time, the tracks they performed live and the tracks they recorded in the studio would have been very different. So it's a shame we don't have any live recordings of the Devils. Kim Chu-ja, the singer who was active under Shin Jung-yeon's inner circle, had released a ton of albums after her debut, which we covered in the last episode. And I can't possibly go into detail today, mostly because there are people way more dedicated to her music than I am. And honestly, I feel like I couldn't do it justice as a casual Kim Chu-ja listener. But here's a great track that has been released several times. This particular version comes from the Golden Hit album released by Sangam Records.
거짓말이야 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 사랑도 거짓말 웃음도 거짓말 거짓말이야 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 거짓말이야
That there, the song was called That's a Lie. As I said, it was released on Sangam Records. And you see, the president of Sangam Records in the 70s wanted to introduce non-Korean people to our music. And so they made a series of these compilation albums for export purposes. Whether they actually hit Western shops, I'm not so sure. But yeah, great riff there. Very iconic riff over here. Great vocal work too. I can see why a lot of people seek out her music. There's some really great stuff on her records. As we talked about previously, the songwriter slash guitarist Kim Gap was instrumental in the success of many 70s rock groups, and that included a band by the name of The Trippers. Here's another cover that I like more than the original. The Trippers version of Creedence's Molina. I don't know. I find that performance more energetic and fun, more fun than the Creedence version, despite me being a huge Creedence fan.
I haven't heard the like Creedence original. Was it as 50s-ish, if I can call it anything?
If I remember correctly, it was more sort of relatively softer sounding. Obviously, it's not a soft song, but it's relatively softer sounding than this cover. This cover is more like a rocked up version, I think.
I mean, down to the recording, it sounds very 50s
Yeah.
or like early 60s to do up, like a mix of the two.
Might also be that I don't like it. I don't like the original because it sounds too clean compared to this version, and obviously I heard this version before listening to the original. The Trippers would continue to make albums under the name Kim Hoon and the Trippers, although their first album was just released under the name of Trippers, is by far my favorite. Now, this next band, I'm a bit confused about in terms of their history. Towards the late 1960s, Shin Jin-yeon had a short-lived band called the Jokers that never really released any records. A few years down the line in 1971, a band called the Jokers releases their first album. Although the band doesn't have Shin Jin-yeon in it, the drummer did work with Shin Jin-yeon in the past, but also not in the Jokers, but in a different band. So maybe the drummer took that name when Shin Jin-yeon formed a new group. I'm not so sure. But the Jokers kind of sound like the later Keyboys, the second generation Keyboys in terms of their music, although with a twist. In fact, the two bands performed a few of the same songs. So I'll first play the Keyboys version of We Used to Have Deep Feelings and the Jokers version after that.
예전엔 깊은 정을 당신은 알아요. 예전엔 깊은 정을 당신은 알아요. 예전엔 깊은 정을 잊으셨나요? 추억이 아름져서.
I think the second one is infinitely better.
Yep.
I feel like first one with the strings copying the melody line from the guitar is so cheesy and like not in like an interesting way.
That was on the third Keyboys album, the one we talked about. That was like very trot based. The Joker's version is much faster tempo and just almost completely different arrangements altogether. I much prefer the Joker's version, but that doesn't mean the Keyboys version doesn't get played on loop in my house. The Joker's releases one more record, this time with a child singer called Ji Suk, and they seemingly disappear after that.
Well, what was with them and having like child singers?
There was quite a lot of child singers in Korea. Not, I mean the singer we covered in the last episode, Park Hwa-lan. She was the sort of only one that I can think of during that time who did rock and roll numbers. But there was quite a few child singers during that time. Remember how we talked about He6 being really busy in 1971? Well, that's because they released 4 albums that year, 4 full-length albums. The first one is the one we already talked about, Volume 2. The second one is a various artists released, comprising of songs written or arranged by He6's lead guitarist Ki Mong-tak, and with He6 backing on every track. The third and fourth albums are the holiest of holy grails in Korean record collecting. He6 Go-Go Sound 71, Volumes 1 and 2. If He6 Volume 1 and 2 were more pop rock based music, He6 Go-Go Sound Volume 1 and 2 are geared more towards progressive and experimental music.
Ooh.
Made up of 6 themes across 2 albums, the records were only ever made as promotional copies to go around radio stations and were originally never released in the record stores.
Why not?
I guess it was too experimental for. I guess the record label thought it was too experimental for the general consumer.
Wouldn't it have been like crazy expensive for them to have recorded like basically a double album's content there?
I guess so. But they were doing all kinds of crazy stuff in the early 70s. Almost every album Universal Records put out was a gatefold design with like full bleed color photos on the back. But basically a bunch of decisions that doesn't really make sense financially. You've heard the He 5's version of Jingle Bells that fade into Inagada de Vida in the last episode. Well, now here's a full cover of that song, which includes a flute solo. It's not every day you hear a flute solo on Inagada de Vida.
How'd they get that alarm sound?
I think that I did wonder that for a while. I think that might just be a keyboard.
But wouldn't those be quite expensive at the time? Like,
The flute player also occasionally played keyboards from time to time, so essentially they did have 2 keyboardists.
I guess so. Did they have the master tapes for these? Have they ever reissued these?
They did reissue these 2 albums in a box set in 2003, and also Volume 1 separately in 2019, I believe. All the members, apart from the rhythm guitarist, got a solo on the track. So we have a bass solo, a drum solo, a guitar solo, a keyboard solo, and a flute solo. All were recorded in one take. Very impressive. And remember, this is the full 17-minute version of that song. So for the past year or so, we saw He6 delve into covering pop music, making it their own, writing their own material, even experimenting with more progressive rock music and longer songs. And the next He6 album will take all of these elements and potentially make the greatest album they've ever made. But we'll get back to that very shortly. 1971 was another busy year for Shin Jung-hyun as he started releasing a series of records entitled Shin Jung-hyun Sound. Volume 1 was a compilation of various artists singing Shin's songs, and it saw the debut of another sister duo called the Bunny Girls. Bunny Girls would get popular in their own right outside of Shin's influence, so not a lot of Koreans know that they were involved with Shin Jung-hyun initially. One of their tracks on the album, Space Travel, was quite experimental as they could not replicate the vocals echoing in the studio. So the sisters ended up repeating the same phrase over and over again since they sounded quite similar, and that would sound like an actual echo. Here's a snippet.
우주 여행하자 달나라 찾아서 우리가 보자 여기서 얼마나 멀까요 아직 멀었을까 지구도 아름다워 달도 아름다워라
That's exceptional doubling.
Yeah.
Was this released on a record?
Yeah, in 1971, on a various artists release called Shinjigen Sound Volume 1. Quite a strange, unconventional sound this track provides, especially for 1970s Korea. It's quite a out-of-the-box idea. We've once again hit the end of another year, and now it's Christmas of 1971. A band called Last Chance, with the help, again, of Kim Gap, the songwriter, releases a psychedelic Christmas album, which I think was very much inspired by He Five's psychedelic Christmas album a few years prior. They even have a 15-minute long version of Jingle Bells, but instead of pairing it with Enagada da Vida, instead they paired it with Get Ready, Rare Earth's Get Ready. Here's a snippet. It's quite unfortunate that this is the only album by Last Chance. It's a Christmas release. But if I were to only have one album released, this is quite a memorable record, actually, with a lot of great psychedelic moments and performances to show off your skills and at least to say that I was here, you know. Moving into 1972 now, we have a ton more artists and bands to cover. One of the new singers on the block was Kim Jung-mi. Although she is pretty famous among collectors today, both Korean and Western, this was when she was just starting out her career. In fact, she only made her debut the year before on the Shinjigen Sound series, although it wasn't a full-length album, just a couple of her songs. She finally puts out a full-length album in 1972, and here's a snippet of one of her songs, Please Don't Say That You'll Go.
간다고 하지 마오 간다고 하지 마오 날 두고 간다면 내 마음은 아프다오 간다고 하지 마오 간다고 하지 마오 간다고 하지 마오 날 두고 간다면 내 마음은 아프다고 간다고 하지 마오 술술한 꿈만 놀아 홀려샤는 달같이
Again, Shinjigen is really good at picking out singers with unique voices. And she was one of the singers with unique voices, especially for a time when psychedelic singers like that weren't very common in Korea. And you'll be hearing more of her music very soon. In the 60s, if we had a band called He Five, now in the 70s, we have a band called Big Five. This band released their first album in 1972 on Oasis Records, although it was widely ignored by the public. Some of their tracks did end up on compilation albums a few years later, but they wouldn't really get to show off their psychedelic work until many years down the line. I much prefer that second album than this first album, but because this one honestly feels like one of those where the track list was picked out by the record label, as was the case for many of these early bands. Nevertheless, they do shine on the last track, an instrumental cover of Santana's Soul Sacrifice, now renamed to Let's Go Big Five. It's a bit annoying that they could do tracks like these, but the rest of the album sounds like old pop music, old Korean pop, to my ears. But as I said before, their second album that was released a few years afterwards is a lot better. Although the Key Boys stopped making albums in 1970, Key Brothers kept the flame going and released a second album in 1972. Well, I say second album, but honestly, it's just like a half album. The first side does have brand new tracks, but the second side is just made up of tracks we've already heard before on the first album, so it's a bit disappointing there. Nevertheless, they do great covers of A Whiter Shade of Pale and Creedence's Lodi on here. A track that feels very prog rock, a track called Drifter's Life, is the last, quote, new track on here, and it feels like a cover, but we tried to look into this with Pharaoh, but honestly we couldn't figure out what the original song was. So if you do recognize this, please do let us know, because we are quite curious to know. Anyways, here's a snippet. At first I thought that was like a Led Zeppelin song, but it still could be, but I don't know.
I don't think it is. I mean, you said that one of them is Creedence song, right?
Yeah, one of the songs they cover on this album is Creedence, and this track is a pretty lengthy 7-minute track. You know, very impressive. But towards like the middle section, they do cover a Creedence song. But this intro section, I genuinely don't know what they're covering. If it even is a cover, which I probably think it is a cover. The Key Brothers go on to for a few more years, and they even release a re-recorded greatest hits record of sorts. Before the leader of the group, Yoon Gi, who previously played drums with the Key Boys, left the band. After his departure, the band continued on and even released a couple more records. However, these were all pretty average and not very significant in any sort of way. 1972 also saw the release of the third and final album in the series of Shinjung-hyun Sound. Remember that? This time, it was a full album by a band called the Golden Grapes, a group made up of mixed-race musicians. Although the track I recommend from this album is the last song, Fun Go Go, I just recommend you check that out because I recommend that you check that out yourself since it works better when you hear the whole 15 minutes of the song. Note, the track title was later changed to J Blues 72 when it was released in the US. The shorter pop rock track I'll play for you today is a song called Please Don't Bother Me Anymore, and here's a snippet. The lyrics to this song is quite fitting with this band because the first verse goes, even if you ask me where my home is, I can't answer, but the place I feel at home is my home.
Aww.
The band Golden Grapes would take on multiple different forms and names in the future, but we'll get to that shortly. There's another new artist in the Shinjingan inner circle, and that was someone called Ji Yun. What's interesting about this record is that side 2 is credited to Shin Jung-hyun, and only Shin Jung-hyun. He actually sings on this record, which was quite rare for him during the early 70s because, again, the Ad 4 situation. One of the tracks he did on this side was a remake of an old Ad 4 song called The Person I Miss. First, I'll play the Ad 4 version, and then this new 1972 version.
오늘도 외롭게 떨어지는 낙엽 소리 들리는데 여기 어디선가 들려오는 쓸쓸한 벌레 소리 떠나간 그리운 님 지금 어디 뭐라고 있을까 오늘도 외롭게 떨어지는 낙엽 소리 들리는데 헤이 여기 어디선가 들려오는 쓸쓸한 벌레 소리 오 예 떠나간 그리운 님 지금 어디 못하고 있을까
Whilst the Ad 4 version was more of that standard 1950 style blues rock and roll song, the 1970 version takes the lyrics, burns everything else down to the ground, and makes a completely different song out of those lyrics. I did also notice that the chord progression in the 1972 version is still the like 1-4-5 blues pattern with a funky rhythm and even with the length of a progressive rock song. One thing that doesn't really work is the lyrics. It feels too forced to be in this melody and rhythm, mostly because the songs used to be completely different sounding.
I wouldn't understand that. I don't speak Korean.
Yeah. Just know that it's the same lyrics.
I feel like the scanshan. I don't know how you say it. The scanshan, whatever. It's probably wrong because they changed the rhythm.
As we previously mentioned, He6 released a ton of albums between the years 1970 and 1971. Within these albums, the group learned how to perfect their musical sound by covering Western hits, making their own, writing their own songs, and even experimenting with longer progressive songwriting. Taking all these elements into consideration, He6 created what was probably their best work in 1972, Love's Hurt / Beautiful Doll. This album has it all, cracking original songs that became a hit, amazing covers, and even a 14-minute long cover of, get this, Rare Earth's Get Ready.
Did they know 2 songs back then?
Anyways, honestly, I would just recommend this album to anyone who's trying to get into Korean music. Listen to the whole record from start to finish, and you'll understand what I'm talking about. It's so good. I would usually play their cover of Get Ready, but since we already heard that from Last Chance, I'll play an original called I Don't Know. Here's a snippet.
당신을 만나면 마음이 즐거워 내 마음 왜 그런지 모르겠소이다 당신을 만나면 마음이 설레네 이것이 사랑인지 모르겠소이다
I love how all the elements in this track mesh well with each other, and you can actually hear all the instruments quite clearly. The massive sounding horns, the funky rhythm section with the bass and drums, the stabs on the keyboard, and occasional guitar licks that don't take center stage, but it's also very tasteful. It's a really nice example of how far the songwriting has come over the years. Again, with most things we've covered, this would be the last album by the original lineup of the band before the leader Kim Hong-tak left Korea to live in the US. Perhaps it was the harsh dictatorship at the time that he felt was restricting his musical abilities, but nevertheless, the band continued on, while one by one, each of the band members left. In 1975, they released 3 songs on 3 compilation albums, although they were nothing notable. And finally, in 1980, a new album was released under the name He6. However, this version of the band only had 1 original member, and the record itself is also widely disco influenced, far removed from the psychedelic masterpieces of the 70s. But we'll get to how the 70s bands evolved in the 80s in the next episode. 1972 was also the year the only album by the group Kim Dae-hwan and Kim Trio was released. Kim Dae-hwan was a masterful drummer who had previously worked with Shin Jung-hyun on bands such as The Ad 4 and The Questions, and now, to celebrate 20 years of his drumming career, finally released an album of his own. Kim Trio, not to be confused with the late 70s, early 80s band with the same name, consisted of Cho Young-pil on guitar, who later became one of the most, if not the most famous singer in Korea, and Lee Na-mi on bass, who also became quite popular in his own right in the 80s. However, this record was made when both musicians were still no-name, obscure backing instrumentalists in a lot of US Army bases. One of my favorite tracks off this album is a song by the name of Do What You Want, and here's a snippet.
This is just Miles Davis's So What.
Is it?
I think so, yes.
I quite like the rhythm sound there, and obviously Kim Dae-hwan's drumming is quite superb. It's unfortunate that the album is all instrumental covers. I would have loved to hear Cho Young-pil sing, like pre-fame Cho Young-pil sing, because if you're Korean, you know how big he is. He could be probably called the king of pop in Korea in the 80s. Kim Dae-won's next few releases would actually be in the 1990s, so we'll briefly go over them since we won't be covering them in any sort of way in this series. Those releases are mostly live recordings of Kim Dae-won with more traditional Korean percussion instruments like the buk. And I have one of the CDs, and honestly, every track shakes your body as these loud, like drum percussion sounds break into your room through your speakers. It's great. The last release from 1972 that I'll talk about is another S-tier record on par with the He6 album we just talked about. Remember earlier in this episode when we were discussing the new debut album by a newcomer singer called Jang Hyun with the low voice? Well, here's his second album called Jang Hyun and the Men. As the name suggests, the backing band is Shin Jin-hyun's new group called The Men. Jang Hyun songs are good on this album, but where this record really shines is on the second side where The Men take center stage. A little bit of backstory. The dictatorship government in Korea at the time saw how popular Shin Jin-hyun songs were getting and requested that he make a song praising the then South Korean president Park Chung-hee. Shin rightly refused, and so he was essentially put on a sort of unofficial blacklist with his songs constantly getting banned by the government. One of these banned songs, Beautiful Rivers and Mountains, was written as a direct response to those requests by the government. Shin thought he shouldn't write about how great the president is, but instead write about the natural beauties of South Korea. And so he releases this 10-minute epic on the second side of an album, and the song is now often seen as one of the best, if not the best song Shin has ever written. There are even some people that say that this could be an unofficial Korean national anthem, and I honestly have to agree. And again, with a lot of these longer songs, these short clips cannot do it justice, so please check out the full song, Beautiful Rivers and Mountains. But here's a snippet of just my favorite part of the song. As I said, please check out the full song. It has so many different parts to it that all sound amazing and magnificent. And it's a great way to say screw you to the dictatorship. Entering 1973, I only prepared 4 albums for this year. Most records from this year I felt were just a bit repetitive or not very significant enough. But these 4, all of which are Shin Jin-hyun adjacent records, are all rare and collectible. First, I'll talk about a solo album by the vocalist of Shin Jin-hyun's band, The Men, called Park Kwang-soo. This particular track was also on the Jang Hyun album, but he has a very distinctive voice. Look out for that. Here's a snippet of Park Kwang-soo's Grass.
나 잊을 수 없네 어디로 갔을까 저리로 갔을까 떠나간 발자국 이곳에 없을까 사랑한 잔디에 잔디 나 홀로 서 있네
Extremely low, deep vocals, and when paired with those falsetto backing vocals, it creates a unique sound, which I quite like. Sounds pleasing to my
Yeah,
ears.
it's really good.
The next album is by a blind singer called Yoon Yong-gyun. This album is interesting because the entirety of the second side is taken up by the song That's a Lie, that was originally sung by Kim Chi-jao, which we listened to. This time, it takes up the entirety of the second side at an eye-watering 23 minutes. Anyways, here's a clip of the title track, Be By My Side. I really like the vocals on that track, very soulful in my opinion. This next album is another rarity, Chaeyeonha's debut album and her only record with Shin Jung-hyun. This time, the second side is made up of songs by a singer called Kim Song-chul, who in actuality was a guitarist slash keyboardist called Kim Gi-pyo, who was in Shin Jung-hyun's band The Men. His songs is what I'm actually going to play in this section because it's my favorites on this record. A song called Miss You, and here's a snippet.
그리워라 그리워 그 시절이 그리워 그리워라 그리워 그 모습이 그리워 나를 미워하고 나를 좋아할 때 사랑하고 있었네 난 그렇게도 몰랐네 바보 같은 이 마음
A lot of Shin Jung-hyun songs from this time have really good drum sounds, drum patterns, rhythms, very catchy. This is the only time Kim Gi-pyo sang on a record, and honestly, I think he should have done more. This is great. I think the only reason why there are so many of these artists who sang Shin songs that only released like one album was because of the success of the other singers like Kim Chi-cha and Jang Yeon and the Pearl Sisters. Back in the day, if it said written by Shin Jung-hyun, you trusted it and you bought that album because almost everything Shin put out turned into gold. And the record labels thought, oh, let's not push back. Let's just push out all these singers that Shin Jung-hyun brought in, and we'll get another Kim Chi-cha, we'll get another Jang Yeon, we'll get another hit singer out of it, which didn't always happen. The last album I'll be showing you from 1973 is probably the best, Kim Jung-mi's Now. This is another greatest hits export album released on Fontana, and this time it comprises of songs from an album of hers released during that same year called Wind, and other previous releases too. Now is one of the greatest albums from this whole boom of Korean psychedelic rock, and is even praised by many Japanese and Western collectors alike. If there was a definitive top 3 Shin Jung-hyun albums list, many agree that this should be on there alongside the Ad 4's first album and another record we'll be talking about very shortly. The track I'll play from this album is one of my favorites. It's called Wind, and here's a snippet.
나뭇가지 사이에 바람 불어가면 어디선가 들리는 그대 목소리 저 산 봉우리 위에 움직이는
Great psychedelic number, one of my favorites. Personally, I think this is where Kim Jong-mi's musical work peaked.
Yeah, it's like very folk inspired. I have listened to this one.
Yeah, the whole album has some strong folk influences, I think. And around this time, Shin Jin also did work with a few folk singers and made, I think, one of the first, if not the first, Korean psychedelic folk album. Now entering 1974, we have a lot more variety and honestly, a lot of great tracks lined up here. When E6 broke up, their rhythm guitarist and occasional singer, Chae Hyun, formed a new group called Black Butterfly. Their first album is still beloved by many today, and here's a snippet of their brilliant cover of War's Me and Baby Brother.
아름다운 그녀 청바지의 그녀 아름다운 그녀 청바지의 그녀 사랑스러운 그녀 짧은 머리 그녀 사랑스러운 그녀 짧은 머리 그녀 약속 시간 지나도 보이질 않네 보이질 않네 yeah. 오늘은 틀림없이 나와줄 텐데
Chaehyun's husky voice works really well on this track, and you'll be hearing more from this band very shortly. But first, more new bands. Phoenix was quite a popular live act in the 70s, portraying an almost hard rock sound according to those who heard them live. They previously did release one song, a cover of a Santana number, on a folk Christmas album. Very unfitting, I know. But it wasn't until 1974 that they got to make a full studio-length album. However, the studio album was widely disappointing as it was, again, bogged down by the poor song selection by the record label who wanted more of a commercial hit. They do shine on one track, however, and that is the nearly 8-minute long album closer, Night Road. And here's a snippet. Again, this is the only real track where they get to do this and show off their hard psychedelic sound. It's pretty disappointing, the rest of the album. I'd have loved to see where they would have taken their music in the studio, but yeah. Another band that released an album under the same label is a group called Netsori. I've seen some people claim that this group was actually Phoenix, but I'm not so sure as there isn't a lot of information about this band. This album is basically made up of funky arrangements of traditional Korean songs. And here's a snippet of Milyang Arirang. great funky psychedelic sound going on in that track, and if this really is Phoenix, more power to them, as this sounds closer to the music they would have performed on stage, more so than the actual Phoenix album. But again, not quite sure if this is actually Phoenix, the band Phoenix. I've so far kind of neglected talking about folk music, mostly because I don't think I'm too knowledgeable in that topic, but also because the folk scene was completely different to the rock scene at the time. It was completely separate. But someone who blurred the lines between folk and rock was the first ever Korean hippie, Han Dae-soo, who basically imported the hippie culture from America since he did live there for a time during his childhood. He started writing songs and performing since the late 60s, but only got to release a full album of his music in 1974. The album is mainly focused on his voice and acoustic guitar, like many folk albums. But the first track, I think, is the most rocking song, which is why I brought it up here today. Here's a snippet of Give Me Some Water.
It does need some water.
He does. That grouchy, rough vocal was not only uncommon in Korea at the time, but also, I don't think any Western bands had folk music quite like that, right?
Not by then, no, I don't think.
Yeah. I won't go into depth here, but mostly because this episode is about Korean rock, not folk. But after his second album in 1975, most of his songs would be banned, and he would move to the US, where he lived there for 14 years before returning, and he has been steadily releasing records again ever since that point. A band that helped out on some of the tracks on the second Handesu album was a group by the name of Mujige Quintet, or Rainbow Quintet. Despite the name, the band had 6 members. Perhaps taking inspiration from the track we just heard, there are some great grouchy vocals on this album as well. Here's an example of such vocals on the track Cool Lady.
멋쟁이 아가씨 날 보고 웃음 짓네 까만 눈 살짝 윙크하네 빨간 모자 올려 쓰고 작은 어깨를 움츠리며 걸어오네 멋쟁이 아가씨 날 보고 말을 하네.
I think if you replace the instruments, I think it could sound like a heavy metal song or a hard rock song with those vocals. Can you believe that the song was banned? Songs being banned in Korea happened before, but you'll see a sudden rise, a sudden spike in banned Korean songs in this story later on. A band made up of mixed race musicians that we talked about, that Shinjigan helped out a few years ago, called the Golden Grapes, now changed their name to Revival Cross, and released a couple of albums in 1974, one of which was a collaboration with another Shinjigan alumni, Ji-yeon, who now went by her real name, Kim Ji-yeon. Here's a snippet of their song, My Heart is Shaking.
내 마음 흔들려 내 마음 흔들려 내 마음 나도 모르겠네 모르겠네 뜨거운 내 마음.
I think this record still sounds very much like a Shin Jung-hyun album, despite it having quite literally nothing to do with him.
I mean, he was the biggest like writer at the time. I like this one though.
Yeah.
In fact, I like this one better than a lot of the Shin Jin produced tracks that have shown.
Then you might like
Like
to
the
check
film.
out a lot of the albums by Ham Jung-ah. He was the main songwriter on this album, and he does quite a lot of stuff that are vaguely Shin Jin sounding, but also different. It has their own like twist to it, kind of like this song.
Possible, very, very possible.
This was surprisingly one of the only cases when an artist made similar psychedelic music even after leaving Shin Jin-yeon's inner circle, as most of the singers went on to sing trot or old pop. Speaking of Shin Jin-yeon, what is he up to? Well, after The Men, he put together a simple three-piece band called Shin Jin-hyun and Yupjuns. You could tell that he gained quite a bit of confidence from all the hits he's made over the years, as he didn't only decide to make an album by himself, but also he was going to sing on the album as well. Usually Shin reuses a lot of older songs on records, and usually how this would happen is that he'd give songs sung by other artists to new singers, and in turn the new singers could make them hits. But on this record, all 10 tracks were brand new. There were actually 2 different versions of this album. The first one was mostly pressed as promotional copies, although some commercial copies do exist. And the second one was the fully released one. The difference between the 2 versions is that while the first version had longer songs, the record label wanted Shin to make an album that sounded more commercial, so he shortened a lot of the tracks and added a lot more distorted guitar parts. This newly recorded version would spawn the mega hit, and what is probably Shin's biggest hit. To compare, first I'll play the original recording, then the re-recording.
한 번 보고 두 번 보고 자꾸만 보고 싶네 아름다운 그 모습을 자꾸만 보고 싶네 그 누구나 한 번 보면 자꾸만 보고 있네 그 누구의 애인가 정말로 궁금하네 모두 사랑하네 나도 사랑하네 모두 사랑하네 나도 사랑하네
The re-recording sounds way more energetic and worthy of a mega hit, but a lot of collectors actually prefer the original version because of its musical complexity and the longer length, which allows the band to show off more of their talents and be more expressive. Me personally, I like both of them for different reasons. Oh, also, side note, the Yupjun's bassist is Inami, who previously played bass for the band we talked about, Kim Daewon and Kim Trio. Yupjun's, like many other Shin Jin-yeon bands, also backed singers. Kim Jung-mi was one of the first to get this treatment, and this song, That's Not Fair, shows off a nice blend of her psychedelic vocals from the Men days, as well as the more improved, funky sounding instrumentals by the Yupjuns. Here's a snippet.
그렇다고 화만 내지 말고 내 말 좀 들어봐요 그렇다고 이대로 가면 이건 너무하잖아요 가기 전에 떠나기 전에
This funky drum and bass sound and a nice guitar riffing in between would be a signature sound of the Yupjuns. The last album we'll look at from 1974 is by the soul group called Devils. Remember them? We previously talked about them earlier in the episode where they made a sort of underwhelming debut album. Well, they have returned with their best work. They do score a minor hit here with the song The One I Miss Is You, but my personal favorite is the track That's Okay, and here's a snippet.
그대가 날 보고 돼지라고 하지만 그대가 날 보고 곰이라고 하지만 그것을 날 보고 순하다고 하는 말 그것을 날 보고
With that riff in the beginning, it almost sounds like a Yupjun song, doesn't it?
Kind of.
And that deep main vocals sound so good. Now, moving into 1975, Black Butterfly teamed up with Kim Chuja for an album. Being two great psychedelic acts, and the album consisting almost of exclusively Shin Jung-hyun songs, I have to say I absolutely love this record. One of my favorite tracks on this record was actually released previously as a Kim Jung-mi song, but it can be heard here in the style of Kim Chuja and Black Butterfly. Here's a snippet of the track My Heart is Beautiful.
이래봬도 내 마음은 곱다고 이래봬도 내 마음은 곱다고 그렇게도 내 마음을 모르고 그대는 왜 하고 있나봐 내 마음은 곱다고 아름다운 꽃밭에 앉아서
You know, fun fact, Black Butterfly, most of its members come from Shin Jung-hyun's old band, The Men. So we have Shin Jung-hyun's band, The Men, we have Hee Six's main vocalist, and we also have Kim Chuja, who previously worked with Shin Jung-hyun a lot. So this is essentially just a Shin Jung-hyun album, and it's great. Love those funky guitar licks, and alternating between the vocals and the guitar riffs is just, it sounds so good to my ears. Black Butterfly also released a second album during the same year, but the leader Chae-hun would soon leave the group, as he did with Hee Six, to pursue a solo career. Just like the Key Brothers, Black Butterfly also continued far after its main leader left. Like the Key Brothers, they didn't see much success after the departure of Chae-hun. Around 1975, Shin Jung-hyun was planning to make a second album with the Yupjuns. Him and his band had also featured in a movie based on the song Beautiful Woman, and were the main casts of the film. The albums were fully recorded, however the Yupjun songs, including the mega hit Beautiful Woman, started to get banned by the government. Fearing the new album was gonna get banned as well, Shin Jung-hyun decided to pivot the musical direction of the new record and write completely new songs that would have been more in line with the government's ideas. Thankfully, the original recordings that were intended for the second album has been floating around the internet for quite some time, albeit in low quality. One of the best tracks on this unreleased album is an 11.5-minute long song called Fairy, a track that has been previously given to a folk singer called Seo Yu-seok, but I much prefer this Yupjun's version. Here's a snippet. Shin Jin-yeon also sings in a falsetto voice on the first Yupjun's album, and just like on that, it sounds quite nice, and you rarely see Shin in that register. Whilst a new album was being made to avoid it getting banned by the government, the Yupjuns also put out 2 instrumental albums. These don't really get talked about that often, and they're often forgotten about due to them never really getting reissues, apart from that one time in the 1990s when they made a best of the instrumental albums and pressed it on CD. I would love to see these albums get reissued because they're very hard to find, and it's basically classic Shin Jin-yeon hits with slight Yupjuns twist to them. Anyways, towards the end of 1975, the Yupjuns would eventually release their second album, and to many, it was quite a disappointment. The whole album had a sort of safe sound to it. Nothing too outlandish, no exotic lyrics about love, no psychedelic riffs and rhythm. For example, here's the leading track, Mountain Sea.
I don't know. I like it again. It's very chill.
Yeah, but the band sounds like they lost their edge. It's just so they wouldn't get banned from releasing an album. But the band do get to shine on the last track. This is very much a trend. A lot of the bands get to shine on their last track for some reason. That's where they really show off their skills. It's a remake of the song Beautiful Rivers and Mountains, but again with a Yupjuns twist to it, and I find myself listening to this version way more than the original. Here's a snippet of that track.
여름이 지나면 가을 겨울이 온다면 아름다운 감사 너의 마음은 내 마음 나의 마음은 너의 마음 너와 나는 한 마음 너와 나 우리 영원히 사랑은 영원히 우리 모두가 끝없이 다정해.
I think I like that song more because of the Yupjun style bass line. I like the prominent bass sounds that are often featured on Yupjun's albums. 1975 was essentially the end of Korean army base musicians. In that year, a bunch of Korean musicians, both rock and roll and folk, were arrested during the marijuana incident, where whether these musicians actually took marijuana didn't matter to the dictatorship government. They felt threatened by the youth culture and wanted to put a stop to it. Many were beaten, imprisoned, and banned from performing or releasing records. In hindsight, this censorship could be seen all the way back in the early 1970s when various records were being banned for seemingly petty reasons. Not using respectful language, criticizing the government in the lyrics despite that not being the intention of the original songwriter, and in the case of Shin Jin-yeon, just because the government didn't like him. These were all real reasons popular songs got banned. This basically ended Korean rock from progressing any further for the next few years, and it put an end to the careers of many musicians, many of which started performing all the way back in the 1960s in US Army bases. But we still have one more episode in the series, the events and albums that happened after the drama in 1975, how the bands and the artists survived, and musicians who spawned from the wasteland. Join us next time when we cover what happened to Korean rock music during 1976 to 1980. Goodbye.
Bye bye.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. You can always contact us at koreanrockalbums@gmail.com. Please check out our other YouTube channel at Paperback Writer Korea, where we post a lot of the rips of albums we talked about in this episode.
뻔하게 밝은